Friends, as Clausewitz said, every war reaches an inflection point and then moves to its climax. Same as with this war. It might outwardly seem as if it's just more of the same, but that's not at all the case. There have been several developments, and if you have been following me, you would know that the first critical development is going to happen and is already happening in the markets. The second critical development is the actions and words of the Americans and the Israelis. And the third factor critically will be how Iran and now the Houthis respond. But before I go ahead, please subscribe and like my channel and share whatever content you like with your friends. We need more subscribers desperately. Thank you. So friends, if you have been watching my channel, you would know that I have constantly been talking about the end of March as a critical time for the markets. 0 hour has now arrived. That is the 10-year treasury bond, which is taken as a benchmark of US borrowing costs, because the US has a $37 trillion national budget. This has reached 4.5%. It's around 4.4% right now. Before the war started, this was slightly less than 4%. For every 1% rise in the borrowing cost, it cost the US about $370 billion per annum. So this 0.5% rise is equal to $185 billion. This is over and above the $200 billion that the administration has already asked Congress. When this number had been hit last year in April, it had reached about 4.4%. Trump had completely modified his tariffs. This had happened around April 2025 last time. The second critical move is that the market fell yesterday by around 2%, US market, S&P 500. The S&P has been constantly falling for the last 5 weeks. In fact, now it is about 9% below where it was in end Jan. As I had explained to you earlier, that the markets had been buoyed, that is lifted, by what Trump had been saying. But they no longer are believing Trump anymore. You can't keep it up just by words. You might see a precipitous decline in the market in the coming week. And if the US market bubble bursts, especially the AI bubble, then you might see global markets falling, including the Indian market. I know the Indian market has already declined a lot and over 10%, and it could well fall into the 60,000s. Right now, I think Sensex is around early 70,000s. Friends, it's not just the Indian stock market or the US S&P 500 which is taking a beating, but in fact, so is the Indian rupee. The Indian rupee was around 91 rupees to a dollar before this conflict started. Now it is close to 95 rupees to a dollar, and it may fall further. As I had said in my earlier videos, it could even reach 100. Why is this happening? Why is the dollar appreciating against all other currencies, especially against the Indian rupee? That is because we are seeing the phenomenon of a flight to safety. That is, whenever there is uncertainty in the world, people take out their money and put it in US dollars, because the US market, bond market, FD, fixed deposits, stock market is considered safer. They are not putting it in the US stock market because the US stock market is also declining, but they are taking out money from global stock markets and global bond markets, especially from emerging markets, which are considered more risky, and moving it to US money market and US FDs. They are also offering a slightly higher interest rate right now. So you can earn better and your money will be safer. That is why the rupee is falling and Indian stock market is also falling. They also fear that higher oil prices will affect India more, because India imports 88% of its oil. So higher oil prices will lead to possibly a recession in India. That means corporate profitability will fall. That means stocks will fall. They might also be further spooked by the opening of the third front, that is on the Houthi front. If the Red Sea or the Bab al-Mandab is also closed, then this will further push up oil prices. The third market, which is equally important, is the oil market. Oil has already gone above $110 per barrel, and it keeps rising. This may well suddenly spike above $120 or even $130 per barrel. In fact, Christine Lagarde, the Euro's financial honcho, has said that the oil market has been underpricing the risk. She believes that the oil price should be much above where it is right now. The market is not taking account the full risks of supply interruptions that have already happened. That is, the damage that the oil refineries, oil fields have already taken, the oil tankers, etc. Even if the war was to stop today, the price would not come back for many months even. So far, the oil market had been listening to Trump's words, but now they are losing faith. So suddenly in the coming week, you might suddenly see a gyration in the oil price as well. All these three, especially the bond market and the stock market and even the oil market, are going to put a lot of pressure on Trump. And you can now see point number 2 that I've been talking about. What are the words and what are the actions of the Americans? Rubio has been saying, that is the American Secretary of State, Foreign Minister, Marco Rubio, has been saying that there will be no need for ground troops and this war will come to an end in weeks, not in months. There have been a lot of leaks given to newspapers, etc., Axios, New York Times, all of these, that America is preparing some ground troops. But the numbers are too small, 5,000 here, 10,000 there. This is not enough for a ground campaign. And as I told you earlier, that the Americans are not going to risk it. Trump is not going to risk his political future by getting huge number of casualties. So, and for any ground campaign in Iran, you need much more troops. You would need troops actually in the hundreds of thousands. I don't think Trump is even going to attack any of those islands that people are speaking about. Because again, there would be casualties there, and not just the average American, but Trump's own Republican base, that is his MAGA base, would revolt. But should Trump make the mistake of taking one of those islands, and should Americans have casualties, this would be extremely bad. Because then you would now be in an escalation trap. That is, if lives are lost, then both Trump's base, which has been supporting this war so far, not too many people, but around 35% of the population, would then insist on more action because they will feel that those soldiers died for them and therefore we must redeem their debts. Trump himself will be in a trap. Then this war could go the Vietnam or the Iraq way with much more destruction and completely out of control oil prices, complete destruction of the Gulf, maybe oil prices well in excess of $200. So I hope he doesn't make this mistake in panic. The other fear that I have, the other way of escalation is if they start attacking Iran's energy, power and oil infrastructure. That could lead to very bad and escalatory consequences with Iran striking back. So I hope Trump does not feel so cornered because he's not getting a way out of this war that he gives either authorization to the Israelis or himself starts doing that kind of attacks, because that would end in not just in the destruction of Iran's infrastructure, but also in the destruction of the UAE, Saudi, Kuwaiti oil infrastructure. Why Iran's behavior is critical is that negotiations have now begun. We seem to be in the final weeks of this war, maybe even the final days of this war. And we know this because of Israel's actions. Israel has really speeded up its bombing because it is fearing that the war could end at any moment and it wants to do maximum damage. But last night, it has made an incredible escalation. It has started destroying Iran's civilian infrastructure to a far greater extent than it had in the past. It has destroyed 2 of its big steel plants. It has destroyed 1 of its power plants. Iran, which has been firing missiles, but at a much lower rate than before, and drones, will now have to strike both Israeli infrastructure and that of some of the Gulf states, most likely UAE and Saudi. UAE because it is very closely allied to Israel, and Saudi because it's very closely allied to the US. If it doesn't do this now, then it will encourage the Americans and the Israelis to attack more of its infrastructure. Much of its industrial base has already been lost. If the remainder is also lost, Iran will be sent back decades. So Iran now has to keep up the fight. That is, it will have to both keep launching, maybe increase the rate of launching, maybe launch some of its hypersonic missiles, and will have to press the Houthis, who have already entered the war because they have just fired a missile at Israel and have acknowledged it. But they will have to be activated to close the Bab al-Mandab, that is the Red Sea, which is next door to the Houthis. If they close it, that will mean another 7 to 8% of world oil supplies will be blocked. Already about 20% of the world's oil supplies are blocked, which would mean that about 25% of the world's oil supplies will be blocked. This will suddenly shoot up the price of oil because right now, This is the only cost which is being imposed on the US. That is, Hormuz is critical, and Iranian control of Hormuz is critical to keep 20% of the oil and gas out of world supplies. The next would be Bab al-Mandab, about 6-7%. Combined, around 25% if the oil can be kept out, then this will impose a severe cost of oil on the US, on the world economy also, sadly, and could well send many countries, including the US, into a recession, could bust the stock market bubbles across the world and lead to very high interest rates. So Iran will have to keep up its resistance at least for a few weeks more, and you can determine the end of this war and what terms Iran will get at the end of this war by how it behaves in these coming days. That is, the US has imposed 15 points in its peace plan to Iran, which includes things like giving up its nuclear refinement, giving up its missile arsenal, opening up the Strait of Hormuz. But Iran instead has its own 5 conditions. Complete stopping of attacks on it, not just a ceasefire, but an end to all attacks, an end to all assassinations, a removal of all sanctions, an acknowledgement of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, which means it should be able to charge toll tax there, reparations for all the damage that has been done, that is compensation, an end to the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, Gaza, etc. So even if it can get 3 out of these 5, I think Iran would be satisfied. But to get those, it has to continue resisting for a couple of weeks more. And it would have to begin this by responding forcefully to the attacks on its steel plants and its power plant that has happened yesterday. That would be a signal that it's still in the fight, that it can still respond and impose costs. And it has to continue maintaining its stranglehold on Hormuz and convince the Houthis to close down the Bab al-Mandab. That would be an extra pain point for the US and Israel. So keep watching. The coming week is going to see gyrating markets, stock markets, bond markets, oil markets, and it might also see some fast-paced action, missile action, bombing action by Iran, by the Houthis, by Israel, and by the US. I'll keep bringing updates to you. Until next time, see you.